Well, clearly the bow is the superior weapon.
Are you mad? The musket is the clearly superior weapon.
Well, actually...
Good morning. Welcome back. I'm Brian.
I'm Charles.
And I'm Samuel.
And today we're going to be taking a look at a topic that has been covered extensively over the years. The term ad nauseum perhaps comes to mind, and that's going to be the longbow versus musket debate. Now, as I said, covered extensively, but often with modern opinion. And we can debate this as modern historians, which weapon was more effective, which weapon's better all day. Our opinions don't really matter that much because we weren't there. And history shows us how this debate won out in the long run. So what we're going to be doing today is taking a look specifically at the opinions of those who were there, and specifically three authors, just to try to keep it brief, or comparatively so. So we're going to be looking at Sir Roger Williams, Sir John Smythe, and Humfrey Barwick.
Perfect. Well, let's get into the bios of these three military writers, and they're all writing in the 1590s. Sir John Smythe was born in 1531, and he's of the upper classes. His father is a country gentleman. We know that during the reign of King Edward VI, Smythe is serving in France, and by the 1560s, he's fighting against the Turks. Now, Sir John Smythe, his military experience comes as a gentleman adventurer. And with gentlemen adventurers, they would be attached to the entourage of a general or a regiment, and they would basically be observers. They could see armies disembarking, setting up camps, fortifications, raids, battles, and they're seeing and noting what's going on. They are observers, so they could participate as much or as little as they wanted. And so they are kind of removed from the traditional discipline of the military. We know in 1588, during the Armada campaign, that Sir John Smythe is training a group of militia. He thinks he's doing a good job, but there are outside commentators who don't have the best opinion of his training during the Armada campaign. Let's talk about our next military writer, Sir Roger Williams.
So Sir Roger Williams is of similar age to Sir John Smythe. He's born around 1539, 1540, and not necessarily born quite as high up the social ladder, but was knighted for his combat service and is a gentleman. Really extensive military career. Got his first experience in France at the start of the religious wars. By 1572, he's ended up in the Low Countries with Humphrey Gilbert. By 1585, he'd been in the Low Countries for 13 years, and in the true fashion of a professional soldier, had served in both Spanish and Dutch forces. By 1588, he is likewise in England training militia in defense of England during the Spanish Armada campaigns. And by 1590, he's back in France. When he writes what we're going to be quoting today, he's still actively commanding, as opposed to Smythe having been writing essentially after his retirement from active duty service. While there's a lot of contemporary opinions on Williams, most of which are pretty favorable, the Earl of Leicester, I think, sums it up best when he says Williams is worth his weight in gold. So now we're going to take a look at our third author, Humfrey Barwick.
Yeah, now Humfrey Barwick, we don't know what social class he was born. We don't know if he was knighted. He puts himself as Sir Humfrey Barwick, but again, we don't know if he's knighted. We don't know if he's gentry. But he's definitely the one that we know very little about. From what we can ascertain from his writing, he was potentially born around 1531 to 1532. Joins the military at age 18. He says he had served under various leaders and under various nations, so he's had experience. But again, we don't know when he was born. We don't know for how long he's been serving actively or anything like that. From his writing, we can assume he's perhaps not born gentry, since he seems to poke a lot at the gentry and say, you're not good like us. So potentially he's more common, but he's definitely the one that we know very little about as compared to Williams and Smythe.
Great. Well, let's get into the arguments. And so we'll start with Sir John Smythe's work, Certain Discourses Military. Now, before Smythe even gets into the meat of the argument, when we compare bows versus firearms, he sees that this argument is not just about pure effectiveness, right, on the battlefield, that the bow is a moral weapon of great history and character that is keeping the English nation sober and pure. He's looking to history for the usefulness of the longbow. As Smythe writes, "Our longbows and archery, by which weapons our ancestors, with many miraculous victories, had made our nation famous, both in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Archery, which is the soberest exercise of all others to avoid drunkenness and other evils, and a most manly exercise and wholesome of the health and of the body, and to increase strength." And so we see he's not talking about just the bow on the battlefield, but instead keeping the nation moral and whole. Smythe looks at a traditional role for noblemen. In the past in England, noblemen and knights were a font of military wisdom. They were the traditional warriors class. They were expected to learn how to ride horses, how to fight with swords and lances, and protect England. And Smythe is appealing to this tradition. He says, "A nobleman well brought up is able to attain to more knowledge in the art and science military in 1 year than a private soldier in 7. And so we see to Smythe, the nobility should lead military actions.
Now, Sir Roger Williams is he's certainly taking a little bit different view. And the title of the work that we're going to be looking at of his today is A Brief Discourse of War. He is pretty brief. It's a short document. He's still actively commanding. So he didn't have a whole lot of time to sit down and wax poetic on a lot of these topics. And he's very blunt and to the point. And his opinion is entirely that of practicality on the battlefield. What's actually going to work and achieve victory on the battlefield? So just to give you an idea, titles of sections within his Brief Discourse of War, he starts with a section here entitled, "To Prove Musketeers the Best Small Shot That Ever Were Invented." He's not mincing words there. He's making his opinion very clear. And then further in another section, he has entitled, "To Prove Bowmen the Worst Shot Used in These Days," and makes his following points thereafter. He does readily admit that there was a time in which archery was dominant and that English longbowmen were the best. But he's basically saying, yeah, it was the case. It is no longer. And he cautions against relying on tradition for tradition's sake. And he says, I doubt not, but all honorable and others which have served in the Low Countries will say as I do, notwithstanding some will contrary it, although they never saw the true trial of any of those weapons belonging either to horse or foot, alleging antiquity without other reasons, saying we carried arms before they were born. He says, true it is, long experience requires age. So, you can't have learned a whole lot if you haven't been around. He says, age without experience requires small discipline. Saying, just because you've been around a long time doesn't mean you've actually been doing a whole lot. He says, therefore, we are deceived to judge men expert because they carried arms 40 years and never in action 3 years during their lives, counting all together. Just saying, okay, yeah, you might have been practicing to be a soldier for a long time, but what have you actually done? What have you actually accomplished?
Yeah, and for Humfrey Barwick and his writing, he, similar to Smythe, does talk a bit about history. He does pull back to those previous battles, both in his experience and in history. But to sort of sum up his point, he writes fairly early on, shall we refuse the cannon and fall to the ram again? Essentially, like, there's this new technology. Why don't we use it simply because of tradition? Simply because it worked in the past doesn't mean it's going to work today. And so he falls on a very similar line to Williams in a lot of his arguments. But that really short phrase kind of sums it up fairly quickly.
Now, Sir John Smythe has a lot of arguments about why the bow is superior to the firearm. But if we boil it down, there's really 3 key points he has. He looks at the rate of fire, how often the weapons fail when firing, and the deadliness of the weapon. So let's see what Smythe has to say and how these other writers compare and contrast with him. So let's start with the rate of fire. To Smythe, this argument is clear. A bow can fire much quicker than a firearm. Smythe writes, "No man of any experience in the aforementioned weapons that will deny but that archers are able to discharge 4 or 5 arrows apiece before the arquebusiers shall be ready to discharge 1 bullet."
Williams does not argue that point. Archery is faster than loading and firing a firearm. That's a fact. But Williams does not seem quite so concerned about it, offering some practical workarounds, if you will. He says, for instance, if any great troops of horse or foot offers to force them with a multitude of smaller shot, they may discharge 4, 5, or 6 small bullets, being delivered in volley, the which pierceth all they strike, unless the enemy be heavily armed, the which are not, unless it be some 100 of 1,000 at the most, of either horse or foot. So he's essentially saying, yeah, it might take a little bit longer to load, but if you're being pressed, if you're being overrun, if you're being overwhelmed with return fire, you don't have to put just a single projectile down the barrel. You can put, instead of that big musket ball, a half a dozen pistol bullets essentially down the barrel, and at that point every musketeer is able to deliver his own volley and still hit hard enough to deal with pretty much, and he's saying basically 1 in 10 soldiers might be wearing armor to resist even the smaller projectiles fired from the muskets. He also goes on to say, in our ancient wars, our enemies used crossbows and such shoots. Few, if any, had all the use of longbow. Few or any at all had the use of longbows as we had, wherefore none could compare with us for shot. But God forbid we should try our bows with their muskets and calivers without the like shot to answer them. So he's saying, yeah, there was a time when archery was dominant and when our longbows outdid everybody else on the battlefield. But now that firearms have replaced crossbows, longbow doesn't have that edge anymore. And if we take archers up against men with firearms, it's not going to go well. And he also points out, beside the munition that belongs unto bowmen are not so commonly found in all places, especially arrows, as powder is unto the other shot. He's basically saying, who else uses bows anymore? You could shoot faster, you're going to run out of ammunition faster as well. If we're the only ones using bows, we're not going to be able to capture enemy ammunition to expend back on the battlefield. Everybody's got powder and shot these days, so the musketeers are going to have an easier time capturing ammunition.
Mm-hmm. And fairly similar to Williams, Barwick talks about how he's not refuting Smythe's point about the speed of the longbow, but his point is more so to its effectiveness on the battlefield. He says, yet the cause of more bloodshed than in these days is used. And my reason is this, that when battles and great encounters chanced to fall out, by reason that the shot were no more offensive. But in these days, where the weapons of fire hath been rightly used, it hath been scarcely seen that either pike or halberd hath come to join at any time before one party did turn their faces by reason of the terrible force of the great and small shot. Essentially saying, yeah, cool. Bows were used and they had great effectiveness, but you had a lot more hand-to-hand combat, a lot more, close quarters, bloodshed that would happen. But when the firearm is used, you don't so much have to worry about that close quarters combat. It's more just a situation of pushing them off before they even reach your pikemen, so your pikemen can keep pushing them off the battlefield because they are far more numerous than the other side. And another thing he actually did mention is he actually has some experience with the bow. He says that I myself did use my bow unto the age of 17 years, and could have shot therewith well, and so from my bow to my arquebus. And after I had used the same but 4 or 5 months, I would have shot at any mark. Essentially talking about how in just a small amount of time compared to the longbow, he is just as good a shot as he was after, say, 10 years with the bow as 4 or 5 months with the arquebus. So it is a far quicker to pick up weapon and, doesn't need such devotion of time.
Excellent. So let's move to that second point for Sir John Smythe. How often these weapons fail when firing. For him, it's no comparison. The bow is an easy weapon to not fail when firing. You simply knock an arrow, pull it back, and loose it. The bow might break, the string might break, but there's ways to really minimize that. Firearms, on the other hand, there are a lot of problems that can go wrong. You could overcharge your piece and it could explode. If it's wet or there's moisture, your weapon's not going to be able to fire. What happens if you don't put the right powder in the pan? You could put too much. You could put too less. The wind could blow it out. And what about the match? The match could not burn hot. What happens if the match is too short, if it's curved? There are many problems Smythe sees when it comes to loading and firing firearms.
Williams is not quite so concerned with the complexity of the firearm. And in response to that sort of point, he says there's neither danger nor hurt if the shooter have any discretion, especially not to overload their pieces and take heed that the bullets join close to the powder. So he's kind of saying, blowing the piece up, look, if you train the guy, if he knows what he's doing, he's not going to put too much gunpowder down the barrel. If he loads it properly, then there's no issue. And he echoes that numerous times throughout his piece. If the shooter be of any discretion, it's basically saying, yeah, you still have to train your musketeers, but if they know what they're doing, then all of it's going to work reasonably well. He also makes the point: among 5,000 bowmen, you shall not find 1,000 good archers. I mean, to shoot strong shoots. Let them be in the field 3 or 4 months, hardly find of 5,000 scarce 500 able to make any strong shoots. He's kind of saying, even if the bow was superior in terms of its reliability, what good does it do if you don't have anybody that can use it well? And he's making the point that it is hard to become good as an archer. And, he's saying basically 1 in 5 archers might actually be able to be truly effective with it. Then you take them on campaign for a few months, and they're sleeping in squalid conditions and eating bad food and getting sick and weakened by the experience. And he's saying now even fewer still are going to be fit enough to be able to, function well as archers. He also points out, also time and ill weather weakeneth both bows as well as the men. So, he's pointing out foul weather's a problem for everybody. The bows are going to fail as often as the mechanics of the musket. Being out in the rain and everything, that's a problem for everybody. Nobody's really got a clear advantage in nasty weather.
And yeah, that's a point that Barwick makes very similarly. But a point that he sort of goes into is the fact that, as he writes, and where it is as alleged in Sir John Smythe's book, of many and sundry imperfections incident unto the same weapons of muskets and arquebuses, as in the dankness of powder, and he goes on to list all the problems that Smythe said. He essentially says there are no impediments where the skillful soldiers have been using the same pieces. Essentially saying, you learn the quirks of your weapons, you learn how to work around some problems, you learn, hey, this is where I need to do better here, this is where I need to do better there, just by using it. I mean, it's a fairly similar thing with the bow and arrow. When you first learn the bow and arrow, your forearm, the inside of your forearm, gets torn up when you're first using it, and then you learn how to save it. Either with a wrist pad or something like that, or you turn the bow as you shoot. You learn the quirks of your weapon, and that's his kind of point is, yeah, you have those problems, but you learn how to work around them.
Let's move to the final argument, the deadliness of the weapon. To Smythe, it's very clear, and he writes, archers in the field do far exceed and excel all musketeers and arquebusiers in terrifying, wounding, and killing both horses and men. Smythe looks to history, and he provides a laundry list of many battles that were won due to the deadliness of the bow. He writes, the great disordering of horses with the hurts of our English arrows I have read in diverse histories, and also have heard reported by diverse gentlemen of our nation that have seen the same. To Smythe, history has the answer. The bow is more lethal.
Williams is following his theme here of being quite contrary to the point. He says, the musket spoils horse or man 30 score off, if the powder be anything good, and the bearer of any judgment. If armed men give the charge, armored, few or any carry the arms of the proof of the musket, being delivered within 10 or 12 score. So essentially he's saying at greater ranges than the bow, the musket will still take horses and men out of the battle. And he's saying even if they're wearing armor, next to nobody has armor good enough to protect them from musket fire once they get within even more effective ranges. So he is offering just a flat-out disagreement. No, the musket hits harder and is more lethal. He says he supports that by saying, and it is important to bear in mind, Williams here is specifying the musket, not firearms in general. He says that one musket shot doth more hurt than 2 calivers shot, far or near. So he said, small firearms, archery, the musket's going to hit harder than all of it and be more lethal than all of it. He says, the Spaniards do use them most and finds their service and terror such that I persuade myself shortly all or the most of their small shot will be musketeers. So he's making the point here saying, the Spanish have found not just their effectiveness, but their ability to instill terror on the battlefield is far superior. He says about the bow, he says, few or none do any great hurt 12 or 14 score off. They are not to be compared unto the other shoots to line battles. So he's saying, once you get beyond comparatively short range, the arrows aren't doing a whole lot. And he kind of concludes again in relation to the arrows themselves. He says, diverse will say they are good to spoil horsemen. I do confess it if the horsemen come within their shoots and cannot charge by the reason of their trenches or guards of pikes. So he's basically saying, yeah, they're great for spoiling horses if the horses get close to them, and if the horses can't then immediately trample over top of them because the archers are defended by trenches or pikemen. And he says, they are ill conducted that lead any great troop of horsemen to charge trenches. So he's basically saying, well, yeah, the bow works in a situation where your enemy is bad at doing what they're doing. And he says, if they do charge, they will be sure to be well accompanied with small shot, which soon terrifieth the bowmen, especially the musketeers. Besides, the horsemen are well armored in such sort that bowmen cannot hurt the men. Now he goes on, he mentions, yeah, they can still bring down the horses, but the men riding those horses are so well armored that they're willing to charge into a storm of arrows in a way that they're not willing to charge into a storm of gunfire. And again, making that point that when archers are on the receiving end of musket fire, they're the ones succumbing to terror and fleeing the battlefield.
Mm-hmm. And Barwick has several points that are very similar, but there's this one that I found that really kind of at least sums up from his personal experience, his thoughts. Now, of course, this is where the truthfulness sort of gets a little murky. I have never saw any slain outright with an arrow, but with quarrels few. But with the arquebus and pistol shot, I have been at several times where 20,000 hath been slain outright, besides mean, wounded, and maimed. Again, 20,000 at one point, perhaps a very long and very arduous siege, but it's the thought process of, yeah, you're more likely to get injured from an arrow, less likely to die when you get shot. While with a firearm, you're more likely to die on the battlefield. You have a lower chance of survival than when you get shot at with a bow and arrow, and that fairly to the point as much as Williams, but so I didn't want to go into all his long things, but it's definitely where the question comes into: where do you see 20,000 slain outright?
All right. So we've looked at the arguments. We've seen the counter arguments, what they have to say about it. How do you feel that sort of stacks up, Charles?
Well, I think when it comes down to it, you have to look at experience. And someone like Sir Roger Williams is a veteran in both the Spanish and the Dutch army, had many years of experience in the Low Countries, which in this time period was seen as the laboratory of war, right? The modern wars, people are learning the modern tactics and technologies, and people are coming from all over Europe to learn these. And so Smythe, his argument might have been true in the 1550s, but now in 1590 and later, we see that the firearm has surpassed the bow for a number of reasons, deadliness and other factors.
And again, to echo what we mentioned at the at sort of the beginning there, Williams again making the point of the importance of real, practical, applicable, and modern experience. He's laying it out. True, it is. Long experience requires age. Age without experience requires small discipline. Therefore, we are deceived. To judge men expert because they carried arms 40 years and never in action 3 years during their lives, counting all together. It's important to note. All three of our authors are older guys. They've all been around a while. But Williams is making the point. What have you done with the time? How much experience do you have? How recent is it?
And somewhat to the point of Williams, but more so against the point of Smythe. Barwick does to conclude this whole thing, brings up the point that it is not possible that noblemen should understand or know the force and effective weapons and ablements of war, as other meaner persons do who are brought up with the use thereof. Some with one, and some with other, and self with all. But neither is it the place of nobleman or worthy personage to become a musketeer, an arquebusier, a cannoneer, a miner, a trenchmaster, or a fortifier, all which are for the meaner person and young men to begin their service withal, and to proceed from one to another, as the body and the mind is addicted. Without these, the wars cannot be conveyed to any good purpose. Essentially talking about how, gentlemen, cool, they're there, but they're not the ones that are winning these wars. They're not the ones that are fighting these wars. They're not the ones who are actively out there deciding them. They're not the trench makers who are building the fortifications to besiege the towns or cities. They're not the musketeers or arquebusiers who are using the firearms. They're, who use the longbow on occasion, at home almost, right? It's that sort of idea of the differing culture where it goes from the idea that it's these noblemen and officers that are leading and, that are commanding these militaries and getting all this credit. For Barwick, it's these sort of smaller, as he writes, the meaner persons that, are the reason why we are able to conclude these fights.
And to Barwick's point there, he's also just kind of pointing out in an even simpler fashion, why are we listening to the opinions of men who don't have the experience with either side of this debate? He's pointing out the nobility, they didn't learn to shoot a bow in antiquity or a musket today. Where's their experience? They're at a level that's above, that kind of, support sort of soldiery. So, again, I think it kind of really sums it up there. The arguments here certainly leaning towards the value of practical experience. And again, as we mentioned in the introduction, history shows us the result. We don't see archery hang around for very long in Western Europe or Western Europe's colonies. As soon as firearms are available, even at their earliest and least efficient, they're rapidly displacing archery. And you can always find exceptions, little pockets of use, but for the most part, archery never comes back either once it's been displaced by firearms. Well, thanks for joining us today. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you have any further questions, I'll leave them below. Any other comments? Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time.